Nvidia's MX line of cards have a fairly questionable reputation, but when you look all the way back at what could be considered the original budget graphics card, was it actually that awful? So this is meant to be an original Geforce 2 MX from the launch of the card whenever it came out. We'll get into the history a little bit later, and I've been meaning to answer the question of, is it actually that terrible? This of course comes after every other video idea I've tried to do today has failed, which means it's finally time to answer the question. So let's get this open and see what we've actually got. It's in a sandwich bag. That's probably what the Geforce 2 MX deserves. Vintage Nvidia Geforce 2 MX graphics card, AGP 32 megabytes. Oh, this is the bottom of the barrel. Peel that off, you don't even get a heat spreader. There's not even a heatsink on this. Oh, well, let's go plug this thing in and find out if it's survived after nearly 20 years. So we might be better off actually clearing some space and using a different monitor, because I don't think I actually have a VGA port on here. A monitor? This PC's been probably one of the best ones we bought. Honestly, plonk in our Geforce 2 MX. And now the question is, does our Geforce 2 MX actually work? Let's find out. And of course, it's worth me saying this, I have tried to film a few other videos and everything else has gone wrong today, so of course the Geforce 2 MX comes along and it just works. And genuinely, I'm not even joking. We've tried to do SLI GTX 480s, but I need a flexible bridge, so we couldn't do that. We tried the 7850 1GB, the last and most powerful 1GB card. Completely broken, arrived dead on arrival. It was covered in smoker's tar, and even after refurb, still dead. So that's useless. But this, the Geforce 2 MX, it's like a cockroach. They just don't die. Which I suppose, after 20 plus years, is something we have to give it. I mean, it's not quite fitting on screen, but it's working, which is nice. But let's just whack some drivers on here. 93.71. Oh, it is a little bit toasty. That looked a little bit like a driver install. Yes, I will restart my computer now. Give me the full power of the Geforce 2 MX. Get quite a few settings. It has died instead. Why has everything gone wrong this week? Why is GPU-Z so unhappy? I think it's just getting stuck. Right, well we know it works, so we can now carry on with the rest of the video. It's actually not even that hot. So the reason we're actually looking at this graphics card today is because everything did actually go wrong. See, there was 2 videos planned before this, and I've just had this thing sitting around in the cupboard, just waiting for the time when I eventually get around to looking at the Geforce 2 MX, so today is that day. I mean, I was going to SLI some GTX 480s, and that was going well, right up until I realised I needed a flexible SLI cable, and the fixed bridge one that I got is actually too small for a modern motherboard, so that went wrong. And then I also got hold of what is meant to be the most powerful 1GB graphics card there is, with the weird and somewhat slightly rarer 1GB HD 7850. And that was meant to be sent to me in relatively good working condition, and ended up being an absolutely hideous mess that was dead on arrival, and it's been too long for me to get my money back on that, so I'm just stuck with that one now. But in the meantime, we do actually have what is a rather interesting graphics card on hand, because I've been going down the rabbit hole a bit on the Geforce 2 MX, and there's quite a lot of interesting history about how it did get this rather awful reputation. Now, we all know that Nvidia's first real graphics card, or at least what they call a graphics card because it came with hardware transformer lighting, was the Geforce 256, and that sort of laid the foundations for what would come after it with the Geforce 2 series in May of 2000, now 25 plus years ago. See, they launched the rest of the NV15 lineup, which was the Geforce 2 series, with a flagship GTS model, and you also got an entry-level MX model, which was based on the NV11 architecture, which is what we've got on hand today. Later on, they'd go on to release the Geforce 2 Ultra, and you'd also see some of the MX boards finally make their way onto market, with a few being 16MB chips, and most, and probably the most common amount, being 32MB of SDR memory. Now, as time went on, they did release a few other versions, and this does get quite complicated because this is where the history gets a little bit murky, and we will be touching on that in just a second. See, in March the following year, they rolled out more MX MX cards, confusingly, with MX200 and MX400 cards, which were either better or the same, or in some cases, actually even worse than this here original MX version. So things got a little bit complicated for the MX lineup, and they lingered on far past the late 2001 launch of the Geforce 3 series. So they do have a bit of an interesting reputation. But if we rewind things all the way back to the start of the story, just how did people find them at the time? Well, most of these chips actually made their way into OEM systems in late of the year 2000, which is something that became more and more common as they released the later MX200 and MX400 chips. The MX400 mostly performing very much in line with the original MX, and the 200 series much less so. Generally though, when it came to the original chip though, people quite liked them, at least those that bought them going into it knowing what to expect. In fact, most of the details and remnants left on the modern internet are actually early 2000s forums threads asking what the cheapest card that could let them play Half-Life 2 was, which usually ended up with this being the answer if they didn't want to buy a used card. The thing is though, after doing a bit of digging, the majority of people buying these weren't people buying them knowingly. It was mostly OEMs that were the real big push for these at the time, with the likes of Dell offering them as an upgraded choice for most of their PC lineup, even if you really were overpaying for the performance it offered. Honestly, the people I found that bought these were actually quite happy with their purchase, and overclockers loved them. They were one group I found online that really loved these basic little chips because you could bump up the clocks quite easily. The best way for someone that's quite new to computers to think of this is think of it a little bit as like the GT 1030. It came out, it let you play everything you wanted, and cost very, very little, so it was better than an iGPU and it worked well enough. But things go a little bit wrong from this initial launch period. So after a rather successful launch window, what exactly went wrong? Why do people hate these cards? Well, seemingly, this is where it all goes wrong. See, remember those other chips I was talking about, the MX400 and MX200? Well, this, in classic Nvidia fashion, even 25 years ago, caused a lot of confusion. See, the MX400 wasn't too bad, I mean, it performed virtually the same as the original MX cards, but it did cause some confusion, because people assumed that the 200 and 400 numbers meant they were better than last year's original chip, and that's the one we've got here. In reality, the 200, as in MX200, was actually under half the performance of the original MX chip and the MX400, and it went a tad under-reviewed at the time. In fact, I even found recommendations over in the AnandTech Best Buys of April 2001, until a lot of the forum users, well, they noticed that the version that had been recommended didn't link to an MX chip or an MX400, it went to an MX200, meaning you were paying the same price you should have been for a good card for one that was downright awful. And the weird thing is, it wasn't even private buyers that got the most ripped off by this. OEMs saw the cost-cut MX200 and tried to cram as many of these things as they could into pre-built systems, usually just marketing them with the MX name. So you paid the same extortionate cost, and you were now getting half the performance you should have been. These weren't the same MX chip that had been released a year before, these were worse. So a lot of the goodwill that had come from the launch of the MX chip, meaning that you could play anything you wanted at reasonable enough settings, well, that had become a tad tarnished by cutting it down further and then confusing people with a name that didn't quite make any sense. Well, that's it surely. That's how it got its bad reputation. They cut down the card too far, it performed bad, and people didn't like getting ripped off. Well, no, they carried this on with their rest of the MX lineup, and we all know about the misery of the Geforce 4 MX cards that weren't Geforce 4 cards, and then they had their abysmal MX 4000, that card came out, it was genuinely terrible. I think that's probably one of the worst cards I've actually got around to testing from Nvidia. But more and more, the MX name scheme just became confusing, and its value and performance was nothing like the original chip that was offered in the year 2000. And as more time went on and these PCs got sold on and passed down, I was actually someone that used one of these. It was in an old Vigeland business tower, and I remember hardly anything I wanted to run on it would actually work. And why is that? Well, now, these current buyers years down the line that have ended up with this chip, the final drivers provided by Nvidia are completely broken on most systems. Genuinely, I got a wave of nostalgia after I started filming the benchmarks because I haven't seen Command & Conquer Generals look like this in absolutely years.
So there was tons of people whose first and only experience with the Geforce 2 was one of these MX cards, and they likely knew very little about drivers. All they knew is most things looked awful, most things also wouldn't start, and if they did, they had rendering problems. Something that wasn't a problem if you could wind back the drivers, but most people, well, Windows XP automatically installs these final drivers when you're using it in one of its later forms. So you ended up with people that were just using this card with what seemed to be broken drivers. And that downhill tumble is pretty much why this card has ended up with such a bad reputation. It started off really quite strong from what I can find online. When you dig back further and you go way back through the archives and things like that, you can find that people did actually like this card. It was very popular with budget gamers, overclockers, and for OEMs it was a decent enough option to offer as an upgrade. But the following launch of cards that were heavily cut down, the confusing naming schemes that made people think they were buying versions better than this but they weren't, OEMs flooding the market with the most cut down and abysmal versions possible, it all trickled down to a load of users who genuinely had no idea if they were running cut down cards, bodged final drivers that were fine for Microsoft Excel but nothing else other than that, and things just haven't changed since then. The reputation they got in that period is what people are still saying today. I asked people in the community tab earlier this week, and the best bit about it is I have researched so much history on these, and 25 years later, there are still an equal amount of people who had one at the time and loved it for what it was, hated it because they didn't know what they were buying with a later re-release, or those that straight up avoided them to get away from all of this nonsense. Nothing has changed in 25 years. What started off as a really strong card has just ended up as something that people hate because it has got such a confusing reputation that you don't know what version you're ending up with. And I had no idea that most of these problems that I experienced with it could be fixed with drivers. You wouldn't expect Nvidia of all companies to have such bodged and questionably working final drivers. So with all that history out of the way, just how powerful is this card if it was the original budget graphics card? Well, it comes in based on the NV11 architecture, which was codenamed Celsius. It's got 32MB of SDR RAM, which might not sound like a lot, but back in the year 2000 that was definitely passable on what was a very cheap graphics card. And at least it came with a decent 128-bit memory bus, because back then, well, if your memory bus wasn't at least decent, well, your RAM speed wasn't going to make up for absolutely anything. So there was at least that going for it. It has final drivers up to Windows XP and Windows 2000, but it also has very solid drivers for Windows 98 and Windows ME, which is where a lot of people today have found favour with this card, as it tends to be a good Windows 9X card. It's got 2 pixel shaders, 2 ROPs, 4 TMUs, and it does actually have hardware transform and lighting. In many ways, it actually is a very equivalent card to the original Geforce 256, and if you can get one of these original versions, it pretty much looks like a Geforce 256 as well. It's probably the cheapest way to get into that sort of graphics card without having to worry about dealing with the MX200 name and 400 name and things like that. You can simply go and buy one without any of those on it, and you can get a pretty decent set of specifications. Today though, they are worthless. You can pick these up in the bargain bin for next to nothing, or I bought this one purely because it looks like an original reference model, who knows if it really is. It cost me £12, it's been sat in a drawer for ages. Now, as much as I wish we were testing with a Pentium 4 system today, because that would seem awfully fitting given the amount of Dells I saw with those set of specifications, I still haven't got around to building a decent Pentium 4 AGP system. I've got all the parts sitting over there and I want to do something water-cooled and completely over the top and just make a ridiculous Pentium 4 system with SSDs and multiple operating systems and a complete load of nonsense. But today we are instead testing with the HP Compaq, or just Compaq actually, Athlon 64 system, which is way more than overkill. I have also propped up a little fan in the bottom left of the PC just to give some airflow to the graphics card, not that it actually needs it because it doesn't actually get too hot, and it doesn't even have a heat spreader on it, so I'm quite impressed that it's actually managing to stay this cold. Either way, we are running with decent specifications on Windows XP, and I have rolled back the drivers to Detonator. I believe it was the version that I found most recommended online when I was going through the old forums with people raving about this version of the drivers that came out, and I can safely say, use these ones. They work absolutely fine. The actual final drivers from Nvidia are plagued with problems that simply don't exist in earlier versions. Who knows if that's just my system, but I remember it being like this when I was younger, and I remember seeing it like this when I last tested this graphics card, which is years upon years ago. Anyway, the real question is, the original budget graphics card from Nvidia that everybody hates, is it actually that bad in the benchmarks? Starting off the benchmarks, we have the very appropriate test of Half-Life 1, which are running with the default settings with the D3D rendering options enabled, and we were able to run the game in 1024 by 768 with no problems whatsoever. In fact, the game pretty much stayed locked to 72 FPS with 1% lows of 71.5 FPS. So it's not like the game had any real problems whatsoever. You could of course choose a higher resolution, but you would see the game drop to around 50 to 60 FPS if you took things too far. So generally what you were looking at was a decent experience in 1024 by 768 using the D3D renderer. Moving things a few years into the future, we can see that performance does begin to struggle a little bit, with Unreal 2003 requiring low settings in 800 by 600 with a few options actually enabled to achieve around 52 FPS on average. Now, from what I understand, Unreal 2003 can have problems on these earlier Geforce cards, but that wasn't necessarily a problem I ran into here, other than performance being slightly less than what I was expecting. I mean, at the end of the day, this game came out 3 years after this card did, and it is still playable, so you could get away with a bit of Unreal 2003 on what was at the time a 3-year-old entry-level graphics card, which is at least somewhat admirable. When you run titles like Unreal Gold, you're best off running with medium settings if you want to keep the game to a locked 60 FPS, and for most of the time we did actually see a frame rate in and around this figure. This was of course with the things like lighting and shadows turned on, so just to give the game a bit more vibrancy and life, and it ran really nicely. It was only during the most intensive parts of the in-game flyover sequence we'd actually see any frame rate drops. Then there was of course one weird issue where usually one of my favourite bits to test is the river transparency, or the waterfall transparency, where it can bring a lot of cards from this era down to a crawl. And here was no exception, but there seemed to be some weird V-Sync stuff happening here, where the game seemed almost locked to 30 FPS when we were looking at it. Now, this wasn't enabled in the drivers, this wasn't enabled in the game, and I did try with a different set of drivers as well, and this still kept happening, so that was the only issue I noticed here. But the big one we all want to see running is Half-Life 2, and with the lowest settings in DirectX 7, we saw the game actually really playable in the 640 by 480 resolution. Now this one is the game that prompted me to actually decide to look for other drivers, because when I had the wrong drivers installed, or the wrong final drivers, in fact I'm not even saying wrong, just the final drivers that are completely broken by Nvidia, nothing seemed to render properly and performance was pretty dire. But here, once we actually had working drivers installed, well, it runs fine. Once again, this goes on to show that people on the forums back then were right. If you wanted the cheapest graphics card that could play Half-Life 2, well, these things were in the bargain bin by the time that it came out. You could pick up a used one for around 15 to 20 pounds, which is what they're on the market for now, or you could go and buy a brand new one from the shops for about 30 pounds because they were old stock they wanted rid of. Not to mention, most pre-builts came with one of these in, so you could enjoy Half-Life 2 on it. It wouldn't look amazing, but it would at least run. Fortunately, Generals was another one of those games that was fixed by rolling back the drivers, and once we had rolled things back, well, low settings in 800 by 600 saw us at the game's frame rate cap of 30 FPS. Now don't get me wrong, there could still be frame drops when there was explosions, and the in-game cutscenes will always run at 20 FPS in Generals no matter what you do. But Command & Conquer Generals, well, it doesn't look too bad even with the lowest settings. This is how I remember playing it, and it looks and runs pretty good, and it's nice not to have the entire world enveloped in a bit of a black square. So Command & Conquer Generals, absolutely fine as long as you're on the right drivers. Halo Combat Evolved can certainly prove a struggle for a lot of graphics cards with the amount of particle effects it has going on, so we did have to run the game with low settings, which certainly brings an interesting look to how things are meant to be, but we did see the game run at an average frame rate of 51 FPS, which was pretty decent and happened most of the time when you were outside of combat. Generally though, when you were actually in heavy combat, you'd see the game run between 30 to 40 FPS, occasionally dropping just up to the high 20s when there was really lots going on. Think about lots of plasma grenades and using the needler and lots of things happening like that. At the end of the day, Halo Combat Evolved certainly looked worse than the original Xbox, but this graphics card is much worse than an original Xbox is, so it is still playable and you could get away with this on what is once again a very entry-level budget graphics card from the year 2000. Morrowind did take a little bit of time tweaking things around because some things didn't have as much of a performance hit as I thought they would, and others really did. Now, given our low amount of VRAM, you really couldn't move the view distance up from a low amount, one click up from where it should be, so you got rid of a little bit of the fog, but you couldn't get rid of all of it. At the end of the day though, this did mean that you could enable shadows with virtually no performance hit. You weren't exactly going to be seeing the great reflections and things like that happening in the water because the card simply can't manage it, but what you can do is enjoy a classic Bethesda title, one that was really quite demanding when it came out, at least a decent 38 FPS average. Once again, a lot of people don't seem to realise that you can actually launch Far Cry 1 using OpenGL rather than DirectX, and for us here, where we have what is a DirectX 7 graphics card, or at least tops out in DirectX 7, well, it means that we can actually enjoy the game somewhat okay with 27 FPS on average with low settings in 800 by 600. Now, it's not exactly always playable, and will drop to around 20 FPS when you're in heavy combat, and sometimes if you're in very heavy combat with lots of foliage around, you'll drop to around 15 to 20 FPS. Generally though, back in the day, if this was your only option to play Far Cry, well, at least it'll launch it, and you could probably just about get away with playing it on the card. Now, some people out there will probably remember being stuck with some Dell Dimension or Dell Optiplex PC that came with one of these built in, and if you were fortunate enough to have at least a Geforce MX or an MX400, well, you could actually just about get Minecraft to run on the machine, and this really was a throwback with TechIt running with version 1.2.5 using the fast settings in 640 by 480 to just about muster a 25 FPS frame rate. Now, it would hover between 15 to 25 FPS a lot of the time, and would go up when you weren't in intensive situations. So if you weren't in the jungle, you could see 30 FPS, which sounds amazing. But at the end of the day, Minecraft was actually playable on these old Geforce MX chips. With GTA Vice City, which is something I noticed a lot of people were talking about in the comments section, saying it was the card that let them play GTA 3 and Vice City, well, they're not wrong. With low and medium settings in 640 by 480, as long as you keep the frame rate cap enabled and stop the frame rate going all over the place, you can actually enjoy the game with around 30 FPS on average. Now, don't be wrong, heavy gunfire and lots going on will cause it to drop to the mid-20s, but this only happened once during my testing, so it seemed to be these were the settings you want to use to play Vice City, and it actually ran okay. To find the limits of this card and find out when it really stopped being usable as a budget card, it's when it starts becoming the end of the original Xbox lifetime. Think of some of those games that were so optimized for that hardware it's a miracle they even ran. And with Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, well, that's about where you'll be drawing the line. See, if you told me that you could play this maybe 20 years ago and this was your only option, well, you'd probably go for it, as with low settings in 800 by 600, at least it doesn't look too awful, but the frame rate hovering between 8 and 16 a lot of the time certainly isn't the most playable thing in the world. So you're looking at games from sort of the late 2004 onwards as really the cut-off point of they're just not going to be a good time on the card, but you could get away with it if you really had to. Now, there's no way at all this card will be running Crysis, but there was a lot of people arguing on a forum I found back in 2001 over whether this card could even launch Splinter Cell. And the good news is, for those people 25 years ago, yes, you can actually play Splinter Cell on a GeForce 2 MX chip. It's not going to be the best experience in the world, and you would have been better off getting an original Xbox, but at the end of the day, low settings 640 by 480, nearing it on 30 FPS during some situations, well, I'd call that just about playable for someone using a budget graphics card 24 years ago. So, overall performance for a budget graphics card from 2000, well, I can see no reason why this card has any bad reputation at all. I mean, yes, it's got its problems, especially with the drivers that have ruined it, but if you look at this from the perspective of what it really is It was a cheap graphics card to get you into the Nvidia lineup, and before they went ahead and ruined it with all the different versions, well, it plays everything from its launch year fine with higher settings and higher resolutions, and it's only when you start making your way through to the end of the original Xbox era that you start seeing games become slightly unplayable. Now don't get me wrong, if you put me back 20 years ago and told me I could play Knights of the Old Republic like this, I probably would have. The same with Halo and the same with those other games. You are more than welcome to get away with playing them. And yes, you will drop down to a single-digit frame rate, but back then the fact you bought a cheap graphics card and were still playing games 4 years later at least a somewhat okay-ish frame rate is decent. And when it comes to the classics, well, Morrowind works fine, Unreal works fine, I mean even Half-Life 2 works absolutely fine. You can see why people recommended these on forums of, well, you can just pop down Maplins and buy one of these for about 30-40 quid, and just as long as you don't get ripped off with an MX version, well, you're going to end up with an okay graphics card. So I don't think the performance is necessarily the problem with this card whatsoever. As is always the case with Nvidia cards of this era, the image quality is, it's nothing to write home about. I mean, it's alright, you're not going to notice any problems with it, and it is certainly far better than the other options like SIS 3D Phantom cards and some of the other dirge on the market that would also be in the bargain bin territory. It's not quite as clear as ATI's offerings at the time, and I will say that ATI's drivers did actually work better for me when I last tested the equivalent of this. I mean, it's not quite the equivalent with the Radeon VE, but it is somewhat comparable, so it's nice to see that this card works okay and you can get a nice okay-ish output from it. I mean, once again, it's not exactly a Matrox card, so it's not exactly going to set the world on fire with the quality of its analog output, but it does seem to do okay, and it definitely deals with higher resolutions better than it does with lower ones, so it's not the end of the world. You'll get a signal out of it, and it does work as a display adapter. So it's always worth mentioning image quality here, but it works okay, it's not the best, and it's also not the worst. It's bang on where you'd expect it to be, in the middle. On the topic of other boring things like image quality and desktop usage, well, it works fine. That's one thing these graphics cards have always been good for, was sitting in an office computer and just being left to run at 80 to 100 degrees for 20 years and still work absolutely fine. It became a boring card for that exact reason, and it does boring tasks well. You're never going to be getting a nice smooth 1080p video out of it because it simply doesn't decode things like that. But if you roll things back to standard definition, think DVD and the likes, well, it works fine as a display adapter there. I mean, I tried to set it up to do some sort of decoding on it. I don't know if this has got the decode capabilities on it for DVD and MPEG media, but it tried, and it was at least trying to do something according to what the codecs page said, so there is always that going for it. It can work as a media center card, and there is absolutely no reason to use it for that in 2025 whatsoever, but it does actually do it. So there we have it, the Nvidia Geforce MX card, the original MX card, keep in mind, and I will look at the others at some point, probably not the MX400 because it more or less is one-to-one with this one, but the MX200 that tarnished the reputation of everything that would come after it, well, that would be an interesting one to look at, because if the performance really is just half of this one, then that is not exactly great. So I think I can safely say from the time this thing existed, well, it was a good card. I can't see anything wrong with it. If it didn't have all of the problems that would come after it, it'd probably go down with a much better reputation, and I'm sure some of the people that did use it back in the day and actually had a good time using it found that. It's just a shame that as things progressed on, well, it didn't stay like that. Where things are in 2025 though, well, I can't exactly speak of the Windows 9X capabilities because I still need to set up a PC that has Windows 9X actually on it. But for Windows XP and 2000 gaming, which is more the realms that I'm familiar with, well, it's okay. I wouldn't necessarily go out and buy one just for that purpose. If you're going to build a retro gaming PC, my current recommendation is still the same as it's been for a while. Buy a Matrox P650 or P70 and you get essentially what is a full Matrox Parhelia chip for about £10, which gives you far better image quality, far better driver control options, and far better stability than a card like this. It's also a little bit unique and cool because the reason you're doing this whole retro PC gaming thing is to build something unique and interesting and special. And the Geforce 2MX, I mean, I don't really find it special. I'm sure if you used one 25 years ago, then you'd have that sort of connection to it that you want to use it again. But for me, well, just buy a Radeon X300, which is more or less a Radeon 9000 series card that you can pick up for a couple of quid, and it decimates this in terms of performance. But if you are looking for an okay Nvidia option that you can pick up for next to nothing anywhere, well, the Geforce 2MX is still okay. Just don't expect it to do much past its release date. I mean, it'll be good until about 2004, 2005 and a little bit of Minecraft. But thank you very much for watching, and good night.